Never Imagined. Story by Jill Asling. I would like you to let your mind wander to an exotic kingdom, long ago and far away. The kingdom is celebrating today because the prince has been born. The king and queen are pleased to see he is a handsome-looking boy. On the same day, at a nearby farm, the landowner and his wife are very pleased to have welcomed their son into the world as well. The son is kindly nurtured as he grows. He follows his father everywhere and learns the many duties of the farm that will be required of him. Even at a young age, the son can see the farm hands have a great respect for his father. Since the workers have always been treated kindly and fairly, they work diligently, and the farm has always prospered. The family is wealthy, but that doesn't mean the owners take their ease. Father and son work alongside the farm hands to harvest the grains or pick the fruit. The farmer's son grows up to be the fine young man everyone expected he would become. He is confident and self-assured, with a strong work ethic. He could have considered himself completely content, except for one thing. He'd always longed to attend a banquet at the palace. Every prince of the cities in the region, and everyone of wealth and note, from far and wide, were invited to attend. But an invitation had never arrived at their farm. People often spoke of the succulent dishes that were served as the wealthy guests reclined at the table. But it wasn't for the food that he deeply desired to attend a banquet at the palace, but for what happened afterwards. When the final dishes were cleared, stories began to be told. The princes of the city regions and the men of wealth and note had traveled far and wide and would tell stories that no one here had ever heard. They would tell tales that no one could ever have even imagined. Now, we turn our gaze to the prince, who has grown to be just the sort of man that everyone had imagined he would become. His parents valued looks over works. He cared more for frivolities than matters of state. He cared more for how his hair was styled than how his subjects felt about him. The prince would soon be taking over for his father. The king was gravely ill. And when his life ended, the kingdom mourned until the new moon. The vain son was then crowned king. The period of mourning had proved difficult for this young man, as nothing trivial or festive had been allowed during that time. But now the new king sent for his scribes. He ordered them to write invitations for a banquet feast, commanding that each prince of the city regions and everyone of wealth and note from far and wide were to be invited. He was completely unaware that his father's jealousy had always prevented an invitation being sent to the nearby landowner. Now, let us turn our gaze to that farm on the day of the banquet. Work on a farm begins early, and the landowner's son was at his duties before dawn. There were quite a number of tasks he wanted to complete that day before he prepared himself for the banquet. When it was nearing time for the banquet, the son realized that the farm hands hadn't returned from the far fields with the wagon loaded for tomorrow's market. He would have to ride out and see what was delaying them. When he arrived at the farthest field, he could see the palace and thought to himself, "Soon, the stories! But first, to free the wagon from the mud." When the men finally succeeded in freeing the wagon, everyone was a terrific mess. Masses of mud with straw clung to them all. While they were slapping at their clothes and pulling straw from their hair, someone pointed out that carriages were arriving at the palace. "Oh, master!" they cried, "there isn't time for you to return all the way home. Surely the king's gracious servants will allow an invited guest a bath and a fine robe in order to attend the king's banquet?" The son agreed, as it would be simply a matter of explaining to the guards at the palace gates who he was, and he would receive all he needed, as anyone arriving at his home would. And off he rode for the palace. The sight of his approach brought the palace guards into action. 2 men closed the gates, and the rest brandished their swords and caused such a racket that no one could hear the young farmer's explanation. In fear for his life, he turned away from the gates. "Surely it is the state of my clothes that has caused them to behave in such a way," thought the son. Knowing he had no choice but to return home, that is where he headed. While he bathed and dressed, the 6 finest stallions were brushed, then harnessed to his gleaming carriage. Off he drove for the palace. The sight of his approach brought the palace guards into action, and they stood at full attention till he was close enough for them to see how handsome and finely dressed he was. Then they all immediately scraped low to the ground to pay homage. The servants at the door of the palace jumped into action and helped him from his carriage, all the while fussing and exclaiming. The sight of his arrival into the banquet hall brought the servers into action. The high prince was quickly removed from his proper place of honor at the king's right hand, and our favorite son was placed there. Quickly! Pillows were brought so that he could recline with ease. Now the young king was ushered in. He had kept every guest waiting and hungry, because he couldn't decide which robe to wear. Now the first dish is served by 50 servants, each carrying 2 silver bowls. Soup is placed before every guest. Our honored son reaches for bread, and the sleeve of his fine silken garment dips into the soup. The king notices the drops of the soup that fall down the front of our guest's fine robe while he sits there, calmly eating the bread. This greatly annoys the king, who, as we know, highly values appearances. As dish after dish is served, the landowner's son again and again allows his sleeve to drag through the sauces and gravies and preserves, with everything from his sleeve dripping down the front of his robe. The guests were beginning to snicker. The shallow king was beginning to become enraged, till he finally burst forth with, "What are you doing? Do you not see how you are ruining your appearances with all that food on your fine embroidered silk robe?" Our landowner's son calmly answered that since it was the robe that was welcome at the banquet, and not himself, he felt the robe should be allowed to enjoy the feast. Our fine young man rose and left the banquet. When he returned so early in the evening, everyone on the farm gathered round to hear what had happened, and he told a fantastic story of a richly embroidered silk robe that dined on succulent dishes while seated at the right hand of the king of the land. No one had ever heard such a story. No one could ever have even imagined such a tale. The story was by Jill Asling. All rights reserved.